The choir loft at St. Bridget's was a world of its own, high up at the back of the old church. The air always smelled faintly of dusty hymn books, old wood, and the lemon polish used on the pews below. Every Tuesday and Thursday evening, as the sun would start to set and paint the stained glass windows in deep shades of red and blue, the members would file in. They were a mix of people from the neighborhood retired teachers, a few nurses coming off their shifts, some high school kids, and parents who needed an hour to themselves that wasn't about dishes or homework. Among them, almost like a shadow, was a girl. She was 17, with quiet eyes that seemed to notice everything and say very little. For 2 years, she had taken the same spot in the very last row, the corner where the wall met the dark wood of the loft railing. It was the spot most hidden from the eyes of anyone sitting in the church below. The choir director, a man who had taught music at the local high school for 40 years before retiring, ran things with a kind of tired precision. He loved order. He loved clean notes and crisp consonants. He believed music was a beautiful machine, and every voice was a part that needed to fit just right. He was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one. His energy went to the voices he could rely on, the ones at the front who carried the melody clearly and without fuss. The girl in the back row, though, she was a mystery to him. She was never late. Her music was always neatly marked in pencil. She watched his baton with a focus that was almost intense. But her voice? He could never quite hear it. In the loud, full sections, he'd see her mouth moving. In the soft parts, her lips would barely open. He had assumed, early on, that she was just one of those people who came for the company, who liked to be part of something but didn't have the gift to contribute much sound. He had put her in the back as a natural place for such a person, and he mostly forgot about her. He didn't know her story. He didn't know that 2 years ago, her world had gone very quiet. Her father, a man with a laugh that could fill a kitchen, had been sick for a long time, and then he was gone. The house, which once felt so warm and loud with his stories and his old records playing, became a place of thick silence. Her mother tried her best, but she was wrapped in her own quiet grief, moving through the rooms like she was trying not to wake someone. The girl found that her own voice had gotten stuck somewhere deep inside her chest. Speaking up in class felt impossible. Laughing with friends felt like a betrayal. The noise of her own pain was so loud inside her head that adding to the noise outside felt overwhelming. She found the choir almost by accident. Her mother, worried about her spending every afternoon alone in her room, had seen a flyer in the library. All are welcome, it said. No audition. It felt safe. A place where she could be around people without having to talk. That first night, she had slipped into the back, her heart pounding. But when the piano started and the first chords rang out, something strange happened. The music wasn't a demand. It was a structure. It was a path made of harmony and rhythm that she could step onto. She could open a book and see exactly what was expected, when to come in, what note to sing, when to be quiet. She didn't have to make up anything. She just had to follow. It was a relief, like finding a handrail in the dark dot, so she kept coming. She became a ghost in the loft. The other members were kind in a distant way. They'd smile and say hello. The friendly retired nurse would sometimes ask how school was going. The woman who worked at the bank would compliment her on her neat pencil markings. But no one really heard her. They assumed she was shy, which was true. They assumed she couldn't sing very well, which they thought was also true. They didn't know that sometimes, when she was walking home alone in the dark after practice, she would sing the alto line to herself, her voice a soft, true thread in the empty street. They didn't know that in the safety of her shower at home, where the water drowned out everything else, she could hit the high, floating notes of the soprano parts with a clarity that would surprise even her dot in the loft, however, fear always won. Fear of being heard. Fear of that single terrible note that might crack and make everyone turn and look. Fear of the attention. To be heard felt like being seen, and to be seen felt too raw, too bright. So she practiced a kind of careful silence. She would let her voice blend so perfectly into the voices around her that it disappeared. She became an expert at support, at breathing, at shaping her mouth all to produce the smallest, most acceptable vibration of sound that would satisfy her own need to sing without ever crossing the line into being noticed. The director would sometimes call out, "Back row, altos, I need more on that amen." And she would push a little more air out, just enough, and then pull back again. He'd nod, satisfied, assuming his instruction had fixed some general weakness in the section. He never knew it was one girl, giving him exactly what he asked for, and not a single drop more dot. She watched the soloists, the ones who stood at the front. There was a woman with a lovely, bright voice like a flute, who sang the Christmas solos. There was a man with a deep, rumbling bass who took the Easter parts. They seemed like creatures from another world, confident, shining, unafraid. She didn't envy them. Not exactly. It was more like watching birds fly. You could admire it without ever thinking you could join them. That was just how they were made. And she was made for the background, for the harmony, for the safe, solid ground beneath the melody dot. She was happy there. Or if not happy, she was okay. It was a place to be. The music moved through her, and for an hour and a half, the quiet in her head was a different quiet. It wasn't the silence of an empty house. It was the focused, peaceful silence of following a path made by someone else. She felt the vibrations of the group in her feet on the wooden floor. She felt the swell of the song in her chest. And that was enough. It had to be enough. She had no idea that everything was about to change. She had no idea that the director, in his frustration, was about to run out of patience with his perfect, predictable soloists. She didn't know that a piece of music was coming that was so difficult, so full of emotional twists and turns, that it would break his usual way of doing things. She was just tying her shoes after practice, looking forward to the walk home in the cool night air, completely unaware that next week, his tired eyes would sweep over the back row and stop, for the very first time, directly on her. The tension started with a piece of paper. It was a Thursday, and the director walked in looking different. There was a glint in his eye, a kind of challenge. He held up a few sheets of music. "We're changing things up," he said, his voice cutting through the usual warm-up chatter. "For the spring celebration. We're doing something substantial." He passed out the copies. The woman who usually sang the solos, the one with the flute-like voice, got hers first. She looked at the title, then at the first line of music, and her perfectly shaped eyebrows lifted. A soft murmur went through the choir as the pages made their way back. The girl in the last row received hers from the retired nurse in front of her. The paper felt crisp and important. At the top, it read, "The Deer's Cry." "It's a modern setting," the director explained, tapping his stand with his baton, "based on an ancient prayer for protection. It's not your standard hymn. It's demanding. It requires feeling. And this," he said, pointing a long finger at a section marked soprano solo, "is one of the most challenging vocal lines I've ever seen. It's the heart of the piece." He had the pianist play through the solo section. The notes that came from the piano were strange and beautiful. They didn't follow a simple, predictable tune. They leapt up high, then plunged low. They lingered on strange, aching chords. It sounded like a conversation between hope and fear. The director beamed. "Magnificent, isn't it? It needs a voice that isn't afraid of vulnerability, that can float the high notes like a whisper and still have power. It needs depth. He looked, naturally, at his star soprano at the front. Let's hear it from the top of the solo. The woman cleared her throat, smoothed her music, and began. Her voice was, as always, clear and pretty. But as the melody twisted, something happened. The pretty sound turned thin on the high parts. It sounded careful, as if she was thinking about each note too hard. On a particularly long, quiet note that was supposed to shimmer, her voice wavered, just a tiny bit. She stopped, frustrated. "It's a very awkward jump there," she said, pointing at the page. "Again," the director said, his smile fading a little. "They spent most of that rehearsal on it." The star soprano tried. She tried with technique, with force, with careful breath control. But the music seemed to fight her. The difficult parts sounded difficult when she sang them. You could hear the effort. The emotion the director talked about, the feeling of a prayer for shelter, got lost in the struggle to just hit the right notes. The other choir members shifted in their seats. The director's shoulders began to tighten up near his ears. This went on for 2 more rehearsals. A cloud settled over the loft. The beautiful, challenging piece was becoming a problem. The star soprano was getting flustered and defensive. "Maybe it's just not a good piece for this choir," she suggested coolly after another attempt cracked on a high note. The director looked devastated. He had dreamed of this piece. He saw it as his grand return to real artistry. Now it was crumbling in front of him. The spring celebration was only a month away. The girl in the back row watched it all. She had studied the music until the notes were burned into her mind. At home, in her room with the door closed, she had hummed the solo line. In the shower, she had tried those impossible leaps. She found that if she didn't think about them as technical problems, but just as sounds that followed a feeling, her voice could sometimes find them. The high, soft note that gave the star soprano trouble felt, to the girl, like letting go of a breath you'd been holding forever. But in the loft, she stayed silent, her own copy of the music covered in light pencil marks, where she had traced the phrases. The Thursday of the big confrontation. The air in the loft was thick with frustration. The director had the star soprano try the solo with the piano again. It was worse than ever. She was so focused on not failing that the music was lifeless. It was just a series of pitches. "Stop," the director said, his voice quiet and tired. He pinched the bridge of his nose. The silence that followed was heavy and uncomfortable. Everyone looked at their shoes. The star soprano's face was tight and pale. The director lowered his hand and looked out at the choir. His gaze, usually so direct and sure, wandered over their faces. He was looking for an answer he didn't have. He looked past the front row, past the second, his eyes moving over people who had been solid, reliable background singers for years. He was thinking, maybe, that he should just choose a different, easier piece. That his dream was too big for this small-town choir. His wandering gaze finally reached the back corner. It landed on the quiet girl. She wasn't looking at her shoes. She was looking at her music, her finger gently underlining a phrase. Her lips were moving slightly, as if she was hearing it in her head. There was a deep focus on her face, a complete absorption. In his frustration, a strange, impulsive thought popped into his head. It wasn't kind, and it wasn't strategic. It was almost a surrender to chaos. He pointed, not with a finger, but with his whole baton, straight down the aisle toward the last row. Every head in the choir turned to follow its direction. "You," he said, his voice dry. "In the back. Try it." From the top of the solo section. For a second, no one moved. No one even breathed. They all thought they must have heard wrong. The retired nurse in front of the girl turned slowly and looked at her with wide, pitying eyes. The star soprano at the front let out a small, disbelieving huff of air that was almost a laugh. The girl felt the world drop out from under her. A cold wave washed from her head down to her feet. Her mouth went completely dry. All the eyes in the room were like physical weights on her skin. This was her worst nightmare, happening in slow motion. This wasn't being asked to sing a little louder. This was being thrown into a spotlight to fail spectacularly. She wanted to shrink, to disappear into the wood of the wall. The director, seeing her frozen panic, mistook it for simple inability. His impulsive moment was curdling into embarrassment. "Come on," he said, his tone impatient. "Let's hear it. We haven't got all night." Something about the edge in his voice, the sheer unfairness of it, cut through the cold fear in her. A tiny spark of something else flickered, not courage, but a kind of quiet defiance. If she was going to be humiliated, she would at least open her mouth. She would at least try. She looked down at her music. The notes on the page blurred for a second, then snapped into sharp clarity. She wasn't seeing notation anymore. She was seeing the words. "Asterisk I arise today, through a mighty strength, asterisk." They were words about finding power when you had none. She took a breath. But it wasn't the shallow, frightened breath of the loft. It was the deep, full breath she took when she was alone in the dark, walking home. It came from a place deep inside, a place below the grief and the quiet. She opened her mouth, and the first note came out. The sound that came out was nothing like what anyone expected. It wasn't a big, loud sound. It wasn't a confident blast of voice. But it wasn't the timid whisper they were used to hearing either, if they ever heard her at all. It was clear. It was pure, like a single drop of water hitting a still pool. It didn't shake. It just was. The note hung in the quiet loft, and then it moved. She followed the line of the music, a strange, leaping melody. It wasn't perfect. Her voice caught, just a little, on one of the tricky jumps, a tiny break in the sound. But something about that break felt honest. It didn't sound like a mistake. It sounded like a feeling dot as she moved into the next phrase. Her eyes stayed fixed on the page, but she wasn't really reading. She was remembering. The words spoke of a mighty strength, and she thought of her dad's hands, how they could fix a broken bicycle chain. The melody climbed, asking for protection, and she felt the old familiar ache of missing him, the wish for a shield against the hurt. She didn't think about her throat or her breath. She just let the feeling find the sound. Then came the part that had been the biggest trouble. A long, sustained high note, marked to be sung as softly as a prayer. The star soprano had always tightened up here, her voice thinning to a wiry thread that threatened to snap. The girl took a breath, and when she released it, the note floated out. It wasn't loud, but it was present. It filled the space without force. It was a high, soft light in the dim loft. It didn't waver. It just hung there, beautiful and sad and strong all at once. Before it gently descended, following the music's path down dot, she sang of every fierce, merciless force. She didn't belt the words. She poured them out, and in her voice, you could hear that she knew what those words meant. She knew about forces that came in the night, in the form of a doctor's quiet words in a hallway. She knew about the merciless quiet of an empty chair at the dinner table. The song became more than notes. It became a story. Her story dot no one moved. The retired nurse had turned fully around in her seat, her hand frozen over her mouth. The man with the rumbling bass had stopped fiddling with his tie. The star soprano at the front was no longer looking annoyed or pitying. She was just listening, her head tilted, her professional pride washed away by simple wonder. The girl finished the solo section. The last note faded into the quiet of the loft. She stopped, her breath coming a little faster now. The spell was broken. She looked up and the full weight of all those staring eyes came crashing back down on her. Her face flushed a deep, hot red. She had done it. She had actually sung. And now, she was sure, they were all staring at the audacity of it, at the sheer weirdness of the quiet girl in the back, suddenly making sound. Shame washed over her. She quickly looked back down at her music, her shoulders hunching as if waiting for a blow. For a long moment, there was absolute silence. Then, a soft, metallic clink. The director's baton had slipped from his loose fingers and rolled off his music stand, hitting the wooden floor. The sound seemed to wake everyone up. He didn't even bend to pick it up. He just stared at her. His face was completely changed. All the frustration, the tired impatience, was gone. In its place was a look of stunned confusion, like a man who had been searching for a lost key in the living room, only to find it had been in his pocket the whole time. Again, he said, but his voice was completely different. It wasn't a command. It was a request. It was almost gentle. The girl looked up, terrified. She shook her head, just a tiny movement. "Please," the director said, the word unfamiliar in the loft. He walked slowly away from his stand, down the center aisle, toward the back rows. He stopped a few feet from her, from the beginning of the solo. Just do exactly what you just did. The choir held its breath. This was a scene they had never witnessed. The director was never unsure. He was never pleading. The girl looked into his face. She saw no mockery there. She saw something else, a kind of hungry hope. She looked at the nurse in front of her, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. She took another one of those deep, deep breaths. The first one had been defiance. This one was something else. It was a choice. She began again. "I arise today." This time, with the first shock over, she could feel the room listening. It wasn't a judging silence. It was a receiving one. It gave her a fragile thread of courage. She closed her eyes. She let the music pull her. The high, soft note came even easier this time, floating up and settling in the air. She sang through to the end of the section, and when she finished, she opened her eyes. The director was just standing there, a few feet away. He had tears in his eyes. Actual wet tears that glinted in the light from the old overhead lamps. He blinked them away quickly, clearing his throat. "Right," he said, his voice rough. He turned to the rest of the choir, who were watching this whole scene like it was a play. "That," he said, pointing a thumb back at the girl, "is how it's supposed to sound." He said it not to shame the star soprano, but as a simple fact, a discovery they had all made together. That is the heart of the piece. He walked back to the front, picking up his baton on the way. His movements were no longer tired. They were electric. "Okay, people, let's take it from the top of the piece. We're going to build this from the back, now." He looked at the pianist. "And you, follow her. Watch her breath." The rehearsal that followed was unlike any other. The director's instructions changed. To the girl, he didn't say things like louder or softer. He said things like, "That phrase, it's more lonely. Can you let it feel more lonely?" Or, "This next line is a hope. Let it lift just a little." He wasn't fixing her. He was asking her to share more of what she already had, and the choir changed with her. Their supporting harmonies, which before had just been blocks of sound, now seemed to listen to her. They swelled when she needed support. They faded to almost nothing when her voice was alone and fragile. They were no longer just singing their parts. They were having a conversation with her. The star soprano, after a few minutes of quiet shock, began to sing her harmony with a new generous warmth, her voice cradling the girl's melody instead of competing with it. For the girl, it was the most exhausting and exhilarating hour of her life. She wasn't hiding. Her voice was out in the open, and instead of breaking under the attention, it felt strong. It felt real. Each time she sang the difficult parts, they became less like obstacles and more like expressions. The ache in the music met the quiet ache inside her, and for the first time, that ache felt like it had a voice, and having a voice made it feel lighter. When rehearsal ended, people didn't just pack up and leave. They lingered. The bank worker came over and touched her arm lightly. "That was just beautiful, honey. Just beautiful." The bass singer gave her a solemn thumbs up from across the room. The star soprano walked over. The girl braced herself, but the woman just smiled, a real, warm smile. "You have a gift," she said. "A real one. Thank you for sharing it." There was no jealousy in her voice, only relief and a kind of shared excitement. The director waited until everyone else had filed out. He approached her as she was slowly putting her music into her bag, her hands still trembling slightly. "I didn't know," he said simply. "All this time, I am so sorry I didn't know." She looked at him, not sure what to say. "You," he said, "are our soloist. This is your piece." He said it with a finality that brooked no argument. "We will build the whole concert around you. Is that okay?" She nodded, still unable to speak. "Good," he said. He looked like he wanted to say more, but he just patted her shoulder awkwardly. "Get some rest. Next rehearsal, we start from scratch. The right way." She walked home that night under a sky full of stars. The air felt different. She wasn't a ghost. She was a girl who had sung, and her song had been heard. The quiet inside her wasn't a hollow quiet anymore. It was a peaceful one, humming with the echo of a melody that finally felt like her own. She knew everything had changed. The safety of the back row was gone forever. And for the first time in 2 long years, that didn't feel like a loss. It felt like a beginning. The news, as such things do in a small community, didn't exactly travel. It seeped out like water finding cracks in stone. It started in whispers after that rehearsal, carried home in the pockets of the choir members. It was mentioned over morning coffee, during a break at the grocery store, in a quiet moment at the library desk. You wouldn't believe what happened at choir last night. That quiet girl, the one always in the back. She has this voice. It was like hearing an angel, but a sad one. A real one. By the next rehearsal, the atmosphere in the loft was transformed. It wasn't just about the music anymore. It was about a shared secret, a collective project. The director was a man reborn. His usual rigid posture had loosened. He smiled more. He listened more. He had stopped being the conductor of a machine and had become the caretaker of something living and fragile. His work with the girl was gentle. He didn't drill her. Instead, he asked questions. "What do you feel in this line?" He'd say, pointing to the music. At first, she could only shrug, her words still failing her. But then she'd try to sing it, and he'd nod. "Yes, that's it. That little breath before the note. That's the feeling. Keep that." He taught her not to be afraid of the silence between the notes. He taught her that a song was not just sound, but also the space around the sound. She learned to trust the quiet, to let it be part of the prayer. The choir rallied around her in a way she never imagined. They weren't just singing their parts. They were building a world for her voice to live in. The altos, who sang the harmony closest to her melody, would watch her from the corners of their eyes, adjusting their volume to a warm, supportive hum that never threatened to cover her. The man with the bass voice made it his personal mission to anchor the whole piece with a deep, steady tone that felt like solid ground under her feet. The former star soprano now sang the secondary harmonies with a pure, selfless grace, her voice often blending so perfectly with the girl's that it sounded like a single. richer instrument. The girl herself was changing. The crushing weight of the initial attention had, over the days, softened into a kind of focused responsibility. She still got nervous. Her hands would sometimes shake when she lifted her music. But when she started to sing, the fear would melt into the work of it. The music demanded so much of her attention, her breath, her listening, her feeling that there was no room left for panic. She began to speak a little more. Not a lot, but enough. She'd ask the pianist, "Could we try that entrance a little slower?" Or she'd whisper to the alto next to her, "Your harmony on that chord is so pretty. It helps me find the note." They were small, musical sentences, but they were connections at home. Things felt different, too. She caught her mother watching her sometimes with a soft, puzzled look. One evening, her mother was washing dishes, and the girl was drawing. The quiet between them was the usual one, but it felt less heavy. Double quotes, "Mrs. Henderson from the library saw me today," her mother said, not looking up from the sink. "She said she heard a rumor about the spring concert, that it's going to be something special this year." The girl just nodded, carefully wiping a plate. Her mother turned off the water and turned to look at her, her hands still wet and soapy. She said, "She heard you're singing the main part." The girl met her mother's eyes, then looked away, nodding again. Her mother didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, very softly, "Your father, he loved to hear you sing. When you were little, you'd sing along to those silly cartoons, and he'd just sit and listen from the other room." A small, sad smile touched her lips. "He said you had a bell in your throat." The girl felt a lump rise in her own throat. She hadn't thought about that in years. The memory wasn't a sharp pain. It was a warm, aching sweetness. She nodded, unable to speak. Her mother wiped her hands on a towel and gently took the plate from her. "I'd like to hear you sing it sometime." Before the concert. It was the most her mother had said about any of it in 2 years. It wasn't a big speech. It was an invitation. The girl just nodded, a tear escaping down her cheek. But for once, it wasn't only a tear of sadness. Word of mouth did its work. The spring celebration at St. Brigid's was usually a modest event, attended by families of the choir members and a few regular churchgoers. But this year, the poster went up on the community board, and tickets started to sell. The woman at the bank told her customers. The retired nurse told her book club. The man who ran the hardware store heard it from a customer and put a stack of flyers by the register. The story that traveled was vague, but compelling. Asterisk, the quiet girl is singing a difficult song. You have to hear it to believe it. Asterisk. A week before the concert, the director arranged a special full rehearsal in the main part of the church, with the lights on and the empty pews as their audience. It was the first time the girl would stand at the front, in the spot where the star soprano used to stand. Walking down from the loft and standing in front of the choir felt like crossing a border into a new country. The space felt huge. The stained glass windows loomed darkly. Her knees felt weak. The director saw her fear. He walked over and didn't give a pep talk. He just said, "Sing it to the back wall. Just tell the story to the back wall. Forget we're here." The pianist began the introduction, the strange, beautiful chords echoing in the empty sanctuary. The choir entered, their sound different here, bigger, more resonant. Then her moment came. She looked at the far back wall, at the simple wooden cross hanging there. She thought of her father's laugh. She thought of her mother's tired eyes. She thought of the long, quiet walk home from all those rehearsals. She took a breath that filled the silence, and she began. Her voice didn't falter. It found the space and filled it, not with noise, but with presence. The high notes rose and seemed to touch the vaulted ceiling. The soft notes carried all the way to the back, a secret told in a whisper that everyone could hear. She sang of protection against every fierce, merciless force. And in that cavernous room, her voice was both fragile and unbreakable. When the final chord from the choir faded, there was a long, profound silence. Then, from the back of the church, came a sound. It was the director, sitting alone in a pew. He was clapping. Slow, steady, heartfelt claps that echoed. One by one, the choir members joined in, not the polite applause after a rehearsal, but something deeper, fuller. The retired nurse was crying. The bass singer was beaming. The star soprano was nodding, as if a question had finally been answered. The girl stood there, blinking in the light, the echo of her own voice still humming in her bones. She wasn't in the back row anymore. She was at the center of something. And for the first time, it didn't feel like being exposed. It felt like being found. The back wall had listened, and it had sent the song right back to her, wrapped in the silent, roaring approval of the people who had helped her build it. The concert was no longer a terrifying test. It was simply the next time she would get to tell the story. The night of the spring celebration felt different from the start. The usual gentle hum of a church gathering was replaced by a low, energetic buzz. Cars lined the streets around St. Bridget's. People filed in, not just the familiar faces of regulars, but people from all over the neighborhood, folks from the hardware store, teachers from the high school, families who hadn't been to a concert in years. They had all heard the whisper. Something special is happening tonight. Back in the small room behind the altar, the choir was putting on their robes. The usual nervous chatter was there, but it was laced with a sharp, shared focus. The girl stood by herself near the door, her simple black robe feeling heavier than it ever had. Her hands were cold. The music in her head was a jumble of notes and fears. What if her voice cracked? What if she forgot the words? What if everyone realized that first time was just a fluke, a lucky accident? The retired nurse came over and adjusted the girl's collar without a word, her hands warm and steady. The man with the bass voice gave her a firm nod as he passed. The star soprano, now singing a supporting harmony, paused beside her. "Just sing it like you do when you're walking home," she said quietly. "Sing it for the streetlights and the dark. That's the best way." Then the director came in. He looked at them all, his choir. His eyes finally settled on the girl. He didn't give a speech. He just said, "It's time. Remember, we're not performing. We're offering. Let's go offer what we've made." They filed into the loft. The sight from above took the girl's breath away. Every pew was full. People were standing in the back. There was a sea of expectant faces, a rustle of programs, a collective breath held. The lights seemed brighter, hotter. For a terrible second, the old ghost from the back row wanted to reappear. To shrink and hide Dot, the pianist began the quiet introductory chords of the first hymn. The choir sang, their voices merging into the familiar opening. The girl sang her part from the front row now, her voice automatic, her heart pounding against her ribs. The first few pieces passed in a blur of light and sound. Then there was a shift. The director turned slightly, facing the choir more directly. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to the pianist. It was time for the deer's cry. The opening chords were different from anything else that night, modern, questioning, a little dissonant. The audience quieted completely. The choir entered, singing the ancient words of the prayer, their sound a deep, rolling foundation. The girl could feel the vibration of their voices through the floorboards. She kept her eyes on the director's hands, now gentle and coaxing rather than commanding. Then his hands stilled, and his eyes found hers. He nodded. Her solo Dot, everything went silent inside her. The noise of the crowd, the fear, the thousand what-ifs, it all vanished, sucked into a vacuum of quiet focus. She stepped forward, just half a step. She didn't look at the people. She looked at the space above them, at the dusty path of light from a window. She took a breath, and it was the deep, quiet breath of her walk home. She opened her mouth. I arise today. The first note was clear and sure. It didn't ring out with bravado. It simply arrived, feeling the silence that had been left for it. As she moved into the twisting melody, something unlocked. She wasn't thinking about her throat, or her breath, or the difficult leap coming up. She was thinking of the words. Through a mighty strength. She thought of her mother's hands, washing dishes alone. That was a mighty strength. The melody climbed, and she went with it, her voice finding a power that didn't come from force, but from a deep, willing vulnerability. Then came the high, soft note, the one that had broken before. The entire church seemed to lean in. She let the note go. It floated up, not as a showy peak, but as a fragile, luminous thing. It hovered in the air of the old church, pure and unwavering, a single point of light in the sound. A few people in the front rows visibly caught their breath. It was not just a note sung well. It was a feeling made audible. She sang of the silence of the moon, and her voice became quiet, intimate, as if sharing a secret with every person there. She sang of every fierce, merciless force, and her voice didn't rage. It bore witness, carrying the weight of real loss and the stubborn will to stand anyway. She wasn't performing a difficult song. She was telling them a story in a language older than words. The choir supported her, their voices a living landscape around her, now a sheltering wall of sound, now a gentle whisper from behind. They were with her, step by step, as she approached the final, long phrase of the solo. A strange calm settled over her. The last line was simple. I arise today. This time, it wasn't a plea or a hope. It was a statement. She sang it with a quiet, unshakable certainty. Her voice softened to a thread, but a thread of iron, and then it faded into silence. For a long suspended moment, there was nothing. No sound at all. Then, as if the silence itself had been holding its breath, the choir erupted into the final, triumphant chorus, and the girl joined them. Her voice now one among many, strong and sure. When the last chord reverberated into stillness, the quiet returned. But it was a different quiet charged full. Then it broke. The applause started not as a roar, but as a deep, thunderous wave that rose from the pews. People were on their feet. There were tears on many faces, not just from older folks, but from teenagers, from tough-looking men who had come with their families. The girls stood, stunned by the wave of sound. The director was beaming, his own eyes glistening. But then he did something unexpected. He turned away from the audience and faced the choir. He began to clap for them. He pointed his clapping hands at the altos, the basses, the sopranos. And then, definitively, he pointed at the girl. She understood. This wasn't just for her. In a flash of clarity, she turned away from the clapping crowd and faced the choir herself. Her face broke into a real, radiant smile, the first one anyone had seen in that loft. She began to clap for them. For the nurse, for the bass, for the star soprano, for every person who had held her up. She gestured with her hands, urging them to stand with her. They did. As one, the choir rose, turning the applause into a circle of gratitude, from the choir to her, from her back to the choir, and then, together, they turned and offered it to the audience. It was no longer a solo. It was a symphony, and she was its heart, but a heart that beat only because of the body around it. Later, after the final bows, after the crowd had slowly filed out, buzzing with the shared experience, the girl stood in the emptying loft. The director found her there, looking out at the now empty pews. You see? He said softly, standing beside her. It was never about the difficult song. It was about the person who needed to sing it. She nodded. She was exhausted, but a good exhaustion, like after a long, truthful journey. Walking home, her mother beside her, the night air was cool and sweet. Her mother slipped an arm around her shoulders, something she hadn't done in a long time. They walked in a comfortable silence. Your father would have... Her mother began, her voice thick, then she just squeezed her shoulder. He would have loved it. The girl knew it was true. She felt a peace she hadn't known in years. She had been given a difficult song, and in singing it, she had found not just her voice, but herself. The ghost from the back row was gone. In her place stood a young woman, different, not because she could sing a high note, but because she had learned how to turn a silent ache into a gift, and in doing so, had given a little bit of that gift to everyone who listened.